se vea... Es más importante que se vea la lámpara de lava que se me vea a mí, obviamente. Pues nada, día 8 de este challenge, este reto. Lo estoy tomando con un poquito más de energía y de alegría de lo que lo estaba haciendo, porque ayer acabé algo por fin, tío. Acabé algo. Cosa que, dicho así, no parece muy importante, pero para mí lo es. Y nada, hoy voy a compartir esto. A ver que se vea bien. Voy a empezar a confiar y todo en... Voy a empezar a confiar en esta historia. Y aquí quería ponerme... Voy a aprovechar para acabar de... A ver... Si agrego un texto aquí... Nah, no lo voy a hacer, ya lo haré. Soy un perro de cuidado. Voy a bajar un poco el volumen. Sobre todo en mis cascos, que no me oigo a mí mismo. Y lo dicho, día 8, estamos ya habiendo cumplido la primera semana. He hecho 2 publicaciones, 5 trabajos acabados. Es lo que hay, tío. No sé, tengo mucho sueño últimamente. Me puede el sueño, estoy derrotado. Pero bueno, he estado esta mañana investigando el tema de COPS. No lo conocía, no tenía ni idea de qué era esto de COPS. Al parecer es el diminutivo de Copernicus, que es un nuevo layout de una nueva... Bueno, layout no, es una parte de Houdini para hacer texturas. Texturas, materiales, procedurales. He estado leyendo un poco y pinta muy potente. Además tiene opciones para hacer machine learning y demás. Pero bueno, he estado testeando lo básico. Está en fase beta y se nota, la verdad. Entonces, si hago el reto como se supone que me lo estaba tomando, debería coger el modelo de la semana pasada, que recuerdo... Ay, no me digas que no tengo aquí... No me he hecho el atajo de Houdini, la madre que me parió. Houdini, aquí estoy. Hice este... Ay, y tampoco tengo el layout, tío, pero ¿qué estaba haciendo yo hoy? Venga, voy a hacerlo aquí en directo. Copiar esto, pegar... por 3. Esto me lo llevo a overlay y esto no se debería ver aquí, ni el overlay se debería ver en... Entonces, lo que iba diciendo, debería retomar... Hola. Debería retomar este dinosaurio triceratops con ganas de morirse que hice y texturizarlo como si fuera de roca. Esa es la idea de cómo he interpretado yo que el señor Houdini quería que hiciéramos el reto. ¿Qué pasa? Pues que la gente está haciendo un poco lo que le sale de las narices. Y todos los ganadores de estos días, que repito, no estoy participando para ganar ni mucho menos porque sé que no puedo dedicarle el tiempo que debería. Me están paranoiando mucho, que creo que tengo la cámara en modo espejo y yo estoy mirando para allá y me veo mirando para allá. Pero bueno, ya arreglaré estas cosas. Volviendo a lo de antes. Firefox. Copernicus, texturas procedurales de piedra. Es decir, tendría que hacer este muñequito como si fuese de piedra. Luego recordemos que hice una silla el día 2. Esa silla debería ser de madera. Y bueno, la parte guay de hacerlo así es que no me siento tan culpable por no haber alcanzado todos los objetivos diarios, porque puedo ir como retomándolos. Dadme un segundo. Aquí me voy a poner escena, selección de escena, Houdini en la parte de abajo y con un fondo así. Y creo que con esto ya me apaño. A ver, Streamlabs, puedo cambiar de Houdini a Firefox, fácil. Cosas que se agradecen, la verdad. Oye, me ha quedado guapo el overlay este de... Sobre todo el vertical, el de portrait, el de stories y tal. Bueno, otro problema que me pasó ayer. He descubierto que, claro, si intento renderizar con Solaris... No, con Solaris no, con... ¿Cómo se llama esto? Con Karma XPU, mi gráfica peta, muere y me corta el directo, porque se supone que está procesando cosas del directo y si intento hacer un render con eso, pues no le gusta. Vale, habiendo dicho esto, vamos a trastear un poco el Copnet, Copernicus, y por lo que he estado viendo hay que meterle un preview material, que es lo que nos va a permitir, pues básicamente eso, previsualizar lo que estamos haciendo en vista front. Luego lo que he visto que hacían en el tutorial era ponerse esto en dark para que no moleste. Y en la escena quitaba el grid, que esto no me acuerdo cómo se grid. Aquí está. Vale. Entonces de esta manera puedo hacer un shop import de mi geometría, ponerle geometría aquí y decirle quiero que te traigas el geotoy. Pues ahora tengo la vista por defecto, lateral, pero obviamente puedo cambiar de vista y verlo aquí cómo va quedando la textura. No estoy muy seguro si hace falta que tenga, a ver, noise, tenemos fractal noise y fractal noise 3D. Vamos a hacer un fractal normal. No sé si es muy necesario que tenga UVs, la verdad. No sé hasta qué punto es necesario. Vale, esto sí que ha petado ahora. Amplitud mucho menos. Center contrast. Igual quito esto para ver el material. Que hay que hacer un material como de piedra. Element size. Voy a hacerlo bastante grande. Y aquí te imagino porque no tiene suficiente resolución. Así que vamos a hacer la prueba y aquí al final de todo hacerle un subdivide que seguramente muera en las púas. Ya lo estoy viendo. Efectivamente las púas que están mal hechas mueren, así que vamos a intentar arreglarlas hoy. Este era el tamaño. Y estas eran las púas que, si no recuerdo mal, moría por el bevel este. Voy a dejarlas así. Vale, aquí ya empiezan a pasar cosas un poco más interesantes. Vale, y mientras esto voy a buscar tutoriales de cops Houdini, porque estoy pez completamente. Wiki en Tokeru, a ver qué nos cuentan. Cops, New Cops Overview. En 2024, Houdini Release. Taca, Old Cops. No acabo de entender muy bien cómo chuta esto. Perdón por el tosido. Entonces, Houdini Cops. Ultimate Copernicus Guide, 5 horas. 5 horas de cops, colega, madre mía. Bringing subs into cops. Vamos a ver, página principal, beta, en grande. How to access Copernicus. To access Copernicus, you can either Cop Network Shop. Adding a cop shop using default cop network. Input and output. Metadata, geometry layer. Intention, Handles, Copernicus Glossary. Vale. Esto está como pensado para hacer texturas 2D tipo Substance Designer, pero es bastante raro, porque yo el Substance Designer en su día lo toqué y más o menos me aclaraba. Con esto no sé ni por dónde empezar. Output. Si hago así no veo nada. Por cierto, no le había hecho unos ojos al bicho este. Igual es cuando me petó el programa y dije así se queda. Y tenía que hacerle la cola también. Vale, si hago un ROPS, ROP Network, Cop Network, puedo tener aquí un Cop Network. No entiendo muy bien el sentido del Cop Network entonces. Porque si tengo esto es como un... Vale, voy a crear una cámara. Voy a hacerlo a lo cutre. Tiki 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 tiki. Vale, y si tengo Copnet, vista de cámara, lo que veo es este truño. Emission normals and displays. Height scale. Vale, aquí puedo controlar esto. Aquí tengo una, dos subdivisiones ahora y tres. Lo que voy a hacer antes de nada es un quad remeasure que ha funcionado en el... Ayer funcionó de puta madre. Y ahí están los ojitos deformes. Y ahora si entramos en el Copnet y le subo esto simplemente para ver si está haciendo bien o no. Y creo que no lo está haciendo bien. Centro 0.5. No necesita ahí. Bueno, pues vamos a ver tutoriales directamente. Vamos a ver el de 5 horas. Voy a pausar esto. La música del diablo. Houdini. Cops. A ver qué tal está el café. Tengo un problema con la cafetera, que es que llevan muchos meses como sabiendo muy raro el café. A ver si algún entendido aquí ve este vídeo y me deja un comentario y me dice: tío, tienes que descalcificarla. No, ya lo he hecho, según indica el fabricante. Uso agua filtrada y aún así me sabe el café raro. Y hay gente como Miguelito que vino el otro día y lo sabe porque vino a mi casa y dijo: tío, este café, ¿qué le has echado? Le has hecho lejía. Real que sabe como a lejía.
You don't have to watch the full 5 hours of this tutorial. That's not really how it's intended to be viewed.
No es el caso, ¿eh? Está bueno, también lleva azúcar, digo, tengo que decir.
Just get straight into it. Now, I've tried to cover as many of these nodes as I possibly can. If I've left anything out or if I've misunderstood a node, please...
Bastante bien, sí. Tengo que decir bastante bien. Lo dicho, tengo de fondo, estáis escuchando el tutorial de 5 horas, que obviamente lo primero que voy a hacer es ponerlo a 1,25. Poner subtítulos para enterarme de algo y compartiros el pantallote.
So COPS is just the new compositing context released in 20.5, and you can create a COP network at pretty much any level, I believe. So if we create a COP network over here at the
no sé si es el caso o no. Full cam, tal. Sí, sí se está compartiendo, creo. Correcto, esto es YouTube. Esto es...
It has some parameters and you can dive inside and it takes you into the...
Y voy a ir pivotando entre esto.
If you are working at the geometry level, that's the only time that the node is going to appear different. If we drop a COP network here, you'll see that it actually acts as a sub node. It's got a few other options as well as an output, right? So you can use an external COP and that would be...
Vamos a aprenderlo juntos, porque...
So say you want to reference this one out here, you can do that. You can reference that one at the object level.
Vale.
If you aren't going to reference anything, you can double click on this and dive inside. This will also take you to the Copernicus context. Over here, we can drop something like a constant. Don't worry about the node too much. This will all be explained as we go. Now, once you place that node, you will see an output appearing.
Color constante, hasta aquí fácil.
You'll have this white square. And in your composite view, you'll also have this white square. In the composite view, you're viewing this as an image. In the scene view, you're viewing this as a volume, but it's actually...
Ah, vale. Vale. O sea, es como que renderizas. Si voy a... Opa, de donde no quería. Si voy a Composite View, se supone que estoy viendo esto como una imagen. Y si voy a Scene View, se supone que lo estoy viendo... exacto, ahora sí. Para que quede claro. Si voy a Scene View, lo veo... Voy a quitarme esto y voy a poner... Esto es como un tutorial de un tutorial, ¿eh? Vale, se supone que aquí lo puedo ver... para que me equivoque el botón. Lo puedo ver como en 3D, como en volumen, y en Composite, o como se diga esto en inglés, lo veo como una imagen plana ya, rasterizada. Vale.
That you don't really need to worry about too much, but the idea is this is a pixel representation of a voxel grid, and we can actually see that this is a voxel grid if we go back up to our sub level and middle mouse on our cop network. You'll see that we have one grid volume. It doesn't have a name, but it is 1024 by 1024 voxels, and so it's a 2D grid where each pixel is represented by a single voxel.
Some voxels
defined by the default resolution over here. Otherwise, it can be specified inside of the cop network as well, if you use something like a size reference, which we'll get into later. But as you can see, if we increase this to something like 4096 by 4096, you'll see that we now have a much higher resolution, so there's more voxels making up this grid. It does still stay the same size, but the voxel size is reduced. So we can just set this back to the default. And keep in mind that this can be treated like a regular volume, so you can give this a name, something like this. We do a name, and you can call it something like density.
Hostia.
You can actually use it for things like an attribute from map, where you bring it into second input, and you can fetch data like that. Alternatively, you can also do things like a volume sample. Okay, so let's say that we're inside of this node. What can we do and how does it work? So this is going to be a horizontal workflow, so you're going to be working from...
No va a ser aburrido este directo, macho, el que se lo trague. Bueno, voy a intentar ir traduciendo y lo que vaya entendiendo y demás.
Left to right, where your inputs are on the left, your outputs are on the right.
Vale.
So
funciona de derecha a izquierda en lugar de verticalmente.
Fractal noise and fractal noise 3D. If we drop that, we have a noise pattern applied to that grid that we saw earlier. Once again, this is going to be a 1024 by 1024 volume.
Vale, voy a probar esto. Voy a probar esto en Houdini. Y esto lo que me está diciendo es que este copnet, si voy a visualizarlo... ¿Dónde lo ve esto?
To that grid that we saw earlier.
Fractal
Once again,
noise.
this is going to be a 1024 by 10.
24, esto fuera. Si lo veo desde el SOPS, debería ver... Yo no veo nada, colega. Este nodo no se ha cocinado aún.
24 volume.
Copnet. Ah, porque no lo tiene aquí. Lo tiene aquí. Eso es. Vale, entonces ahora si añado un noise aquí, fractal noise, en la parte de atrás, correcto, 1.000.000 de voxels, que es lo que representa la imagen. Y si voy a visualizar esto, aquí lo veo de esta manera y aquí de esta. Vale, pero dentro de SOPs y dentro de un objeto de geometría.
It now just has some data applied to it. So each voxel is treated as a pixel, and each pixel has a value. We can play around with things like the amplitude of our noise.
Hostia, pues es potente esto, ¿eh?
To this. Now, if you want to reference something that's inside of a cop network, but you don't necessarily want to use it as an output, there is a way to do that, and I'll just show this by dropping something like a rubber toy, and then using a UV quick shade. In this UV quick shade, if we want to reference that noise that we just created, we can do something like a null, and if we plug this into the null, we can give this a name like texture out. Then all we have to do is copy this node's path. So we can select it and press Ctrl C, go up a level, and on this quick shade, under the texture map, press Ctrl V, and it'll paste the path to that node.
¿Sí?
Right. If we click away, it won't actually work.
¿Y dónde está el ruido?
One special piece of syntax that we need, and that is just the OP prefix. So it's op, colon, the path. Right, so OP, colon, path. And then that will now fetch this
amigo.
particular texture. and apply it as a texture map. And you can do this in any context. So if you're creating materials, you can actually do this exact same thing and do this for things like your diffuse.
Ubiquick shade, ok. Pero si en vez de Ubiquick shade es un material...
With the location, so with the path to the node that you want to reference. Now, inside of the sculpt network, let's take a look at a few other things. As you can see, on this noise being output here, there is a blue output. Now, blue is for a mono, and you will also see on the node that this...
Vale, que es un solo canal, si es de color azul.
Component value, same as a float. So
se empieza a poner interesante esto, ¿eh?
And so each one of these pixels can have any negative decimal value or any positive decimal value, but it is a single component. If we switch this to UV, that makes it a 2D noise. So what we now have is a red channel and a green channel, and you'll see that this changes to an orange output. That just means that it's a UV. If we change this to RGB, this gives...
Y esto es RGB, que son 3 canales ya.
Red, green, and blue, and this changes our output to this green type. Then we have RGBA, and this is just red, green, blue with an alpha channel.
Y amarillo es con alfa, son 4 canales, o sea, es 1, 2, 3 o 4 canales.
Something like this, which is a geometry output. And so if I just dive inside of here and drop something like a grid, what this gives us is an actual piece of geometry, and there are certain nodes at the cop level that will allow you to work with geometry. But most of the time you're going to be working with mono, UV, RGB, RGBA. The only other one that you should be aware of is
aquí intentando entrar,
ID is just a unique integer value per ID tile. Now, in this situation where we have the tile pattern node, which we will get into later, or you can skip ahead if you want to find out more about it, this generates a bunch of tiles, and each tile has a unique ID. And now you will notice that we actually have more than one output on this node. So on this tile pattern node in the bottom right, we have more than one output. You can see that we have a mono, we have an ID, and we have UVs. If you want to change what you're previewing, you can switch between these. So click on the bottom right corner of this node where it says tiles, and you can switch to ID or UV.
Vale.
Now do keep in mind that this is just for preview purposes. If we go up a level, what is being output is whatever you have your display flag on. So it'll be the first output of whatever you have your display flag on. At this level, we're just previewing, and you can actually see that it says...
No entiendo por qué, pero vale.
We can switch this back to just the tiles, and then that note will just disappear. So as you can see, when we switch it, it tells us which output we are viewing. Do keep in mind that a lot of the time, you can't just switch between signatures. So having a signature of mono, you won't just be able to go to an RGB input. You can see that inputs have a signature and outputs have a signature. So something like a fractal noise 3D is expecting an RGB value for an input, and then it can output whatever signature we choose over here. So when we choose signature, this is for the output.
Entendido.
So sometimes you may need to do conversions, and there are a bunch of conversion options under the layer tab. You can see we have all sorts of conversions.
Layer conversion, okay.
All of that later in this video. Now, the last thing before we actually get into this video.
Esto lo tengo bastante controlado en Blender porque lo uso bastante en el curro y también de hecho bastantes cursos y en su día de Substance, tanto Painter, pero sobre todo Designer. Hice, bueno, me dio por ahí, me dio por el shading procedural y luego lo dejé. Se quedó ahí porque no le encontraba utilidad al día a día. Te tardaba un montonazo en hacer un... Entonces para videojuegos y demás puede estar muy chulo, pero para cosas muy específicas y sobre todo para lo que hacemos en el curro, no.
I just wanted to mention some of the things that are hidden from us, because oftentimes in Houdini, the most complicated things are the things that are hidden. So when we drop something like a constant or even a noise, this will always have a range, right? So any of these values will have a particular range. If you were to drop a constant, and let's just give it a value of 1, you can see that 1 appears as white, and 0 appears as black.
Vale.
But if you go to something like 5, that also appears as white, so does 10. And the thing is, any negative number also appears as black.
Esto es complicado.
This is important because we need to know the actual values that we're working with, and we can't just assume that black is going to be 0 and 1 is going to be white.
¿Y cómo lo vas a ver los valores?
Situation where we have -10 as the value, how would we know about that? Now, one way that we can test for this is if we go over to the composite view, and in the composite view, we can right-click and say inspect. And if we take a look at this, you can see that it has in the bottom left of our inspect panel a value of -10.
Ya que te da el valor. Okay.
Value of 10. You can start clamping it to a maximum of 1. You can see now that the maximum value is 1, even though there is no visible difference between 0 and up here.
Un clamp esto.
If you take a look at this information on the actual COP network, you'll see
Vale.
resolution, pixel scale, default border, default precision, and tile visualization. And all of those settings are what are known as layer properties. Now, when we drop something like a constant node, the reason that it is this resolution is because it's fetching the layer property from up here. And this is what we call a layer. And so this layer has a particular resolution. Now, if you were to create something like a size reference, then the size reference can have its own settings. For example, activate the resolution, and this layer...
Ya empezamos.
...to this one. Right. So there are layer properties that get passed along with a particular node that you may not necessarily see, but these are those values. Right, so all of these on here, these are just layer properties. And the last thing that I just want to mention is the space that we're going to be working in with cops. If we look in our viewport, you can see that our range doesn't go from 0 to 1. Right? Commonly, if you're working with something like UVs,
¿Cómo que no?
space is going to be 0 to 1, and so it would start 0, 0 and move to the top right. And
Y aquí también, ¿no?
But when we're working in Copernicus, it's actually -1, -1,
Ah, bueno.
bottom left, and 1, 1 in the top right.
Vale, no va de 0 a 1, sino de -1 a 1.
Because sometimes we may be working with a position map or UVs, and we're expecting one space but getting another. So Copernicus is going to be in this -1, -1 to 1, 1 space.
Vale.
I think that's all we really need as a foundation to get into this tutorial. So
Hemos empezado bien, ya sabemos lo básico.
the first nodes that I'm going to go over are the ones that I use the most. We're then going to look at all of the others. So we can drop a copy network.
Vale.
I'll begin with the constant node. The
Vale.
constant node just generates a single color of a particular signature. We can change the signature from mono,
Hasta aquí fácil, gente.
RGBA, and then control each one of its components right over here.
Me encanta que luego
Square. We just make it.
búscate la vida tú para relacionar conceptos, ¿eh?
If we just need a value to, say, multiply something by, we can use it as mono, and this is just a float value that can be whatever we want it to be. The size that is generated is based off of the default resolution, unless a source is given. This brings me onto the next node. Size reference is a node that defines...
Tengamos en cuenta que llevamos 13 minutos, porque lo estoy viendo rápido, de 5 horas, ¿eh? Lo más probable es que hoy no me dé tiempo a acabar nada. Pero bueno, lo que no me dé tiempo hoy y mañana. Se trata de un poco de aprender también Copernicus durante esta semana.
For a particular node. So in the case of a constant which requests a source, if we put the size reference in, we can
Vale.
define a particular resolution for this constant to take on. It will take the resolution given by the size reference. So if we want this to be tiny, so just a 5 by 5, so this is 5 pixels by 5 pixels, that is how we would do it. We can make this whatever we want, but this is a useful way of controlling the size of our layer. This is also useful when working with noises. So if we have a fractal noise, you'll see that it has a size ref option. Plug that in, and you can change the size of this noise. Fractal noise is going
Con
to
eso la resolución, claro.
useful nodes in all of COPs. The default is a mono, so it is a single component value. We have amplitude, center, and contrast. If we increase the amplitude, it increases the range, so higher and lower values. The center is just where this noise begins. So by increasing the center, you end up with generally...
Sería bien que esté en 0,5, porque si en vez de 0 a 1 va de -1 a 1, pues el 0,5 es 0.
As we reduce that, we get closer to this flat gray. The noise type, we have Taurus by default, Perlin, and Wally. If you want both of the components from Wally, so F1 and F2, so that you can use them separately, you can use a Wally noise.
Ah, vale, puedes sacarlos por separado los componentes.
F1 and F2, as well as
Okay.
a border center in a. You'll begin to notice this are going to be seamless at the cop level. We then have the option for 3D noise. This is noise that exists in 3D space, so we're taking a cross-section of a noise pattern, but it is also animated by default. If you play it back, the noise animates over time.
Interesante que esté animado por defecto ya.
Noise in the third dimension. So as we increase this, it will appear that there are slower undulations occurring in our noise. We can decrease moving noise. Time scale, because pulse length is just in case it shows that the noise 78, 72, the noise will be the same, but we'll start again. Is the number as you would a very rough pattern. As for the two inputs, position and time, if we put a constant into time and adjust its value, you won't see any change. And that's simply because this requires the 3D noise to be active, and then you'll see that it won't play back by default anymore, but it'll be controlled by this constant.
Ah, vale, con esta constante controla el tiempo. Vale, vale.
As for the position, we can feed this noise UV coordinates and distort it in various ways based on those UVs. You can also use the fractal noise 3D, and this can work with a vector 3, so that's RGB. That's if you have something like a position in world space, then you can use that. This is for if you want to use a UV.
Está guay porque puedes ponerle una imagen y...
Noise output. That's going to bring us onto our next node. The remap node is extremely useful for adjusting the range of values coming into it. So
Remapping.
put minimum, maximum, and it's between this. If it stays perfectly below birds.
Esto es usarlo porque funciona igual que...
Simply code remap.
Vale.
Do from our fractal.
Remap, ramp.
If we were to change the signal, so if
Perfecto, está bueno saberlo.
how they work,
Ah, está bien para colores, claro. Puedes trabajar de escala de grises a colores. Esto está guay.
give this infrared, and let's take a look at number of cycles, phase, and eventually we'll look at rotation as well. Number, but the outstanding clamp
Vale.
cycle, this causes an issue by the of cycles that we're using. If we quickly
Está guay porque se puede animar.
adding the implement no default, we're going to end up with a value of 0. If we were to switch our constant, and it's going to
Invert.
actually see it's going to give us a 5 and 1, it's going to give us a value of -1. And if you have a value of 0, it won't do anything. So a complement is generally useful for 0 to 1 ranges. Negate is useful for just flipping the sign of something. Now, as for reciprocal, this is going to be 1 divided by the input. So if our input is a value
Eso es
of
para
1,
normalizar esto.
which is a value of 1. But if we do something like 0.3, then it's going to be 1 divided by 0.3, which is going to give us a value of 3.3. And if we have a negative value, it's going to do the same thing. So 0.1. So if we put it into an equalize, you won't notice any difference. That's because this is already a perfect
Vale, está el nodo ramp, que también es interesante.
so useful is when you have values that exceed this 0 to 1
¿De cuáles no entiendo?
If we were to do something like a multiply constant on this ramp, you might end up with something where these values all appear as white. Now, the thing is, those values are exceeding a value of 1. So even though they may all appear white, and you may assume that they're all a value of 1, that may not be true. So when you put it into the equalize node, it brings it back into this 0 to 1 range. Now, of course, this
es como que normaliza.
that you're choosing here. For example, by default, it is stretched to black and white. In other words, stretched to 0 and 1. We have move minimum to black, and you'll see that it doesn't really do anything to the white values. We also have move maximum to white, and what that ends up doing is it shifts everything down until the brightest point reaches a value.
Ojo,
That's why you have one method over here. That is to 10, and the light this and the brightness over time. So let's do exactly what we're aiming at.
Vale.
Blend node. By default.
Oh, mira el blend.
One red, and we'll make one blue. Red and blue. Plug them into this blend node. We have a background and a foreground, and then we can blend between the two.
Tienes una máscara aquí. Vale. Esa máscara puede ser un ruido, puede ser cualquier.
This is what makes it such a useful node. Because let's say instead of blending between these two, we want to add them together to get purple.
Esto es mix color en Blender, vaya.
We can use code based on blending noises. So if appearing in certain places, well, we can multiply these two values together. So let's multiply each of these noises together using a blend node. Switch this to multiply. Now we can blend certain areas based on each of these noises. Additionally, we can
¿Qué pasa, ratoncito Pérez? Estoy viendo un tutorial de 5 horas de Houdini, de Copernicus, de shading, bueno, de texturas. Se supone que... Vuelvo aquí. Hoy debería texturizarlo como si fuera de roca. Pero claro, no sé dónde pone aquí las bases que no puedes usar material externo. No puedes coger de librerías y decir, cojo una textura de ropa, un normal map de aquí, de roca, perdón, un normal map de aquí y lo junto y me quedo tan ancho. La idea es que tengas que hacerlo todo procedural. La semana que viene habrá que animar este bicho y hacer que corra. La semana siguiente habrá que hacer que explote. Y ese es acumulativo, entonces guay porque no tienes que hacer algo en un día, que hay gente que es muy flipada y si te metes en el foro, cosa que hoy no he hecho pero acostumbro a hacerlo al principio de los directos, pues ves que el día 7, por ejemplo ayer, había gente haciendo criaturas, que había que hacer criaturas pues muy curradas, que dices, tío, ¿cómo coño te da tiempo a hacer esto en un día? Bueno, entonces respuesta corta, ¿estoy aprendiendo Houdini? Sí, siempre, creo que nunca se deja de aprender Houdini. Yo hice un máster en Animum de FX, con lo que hay una parte, pero claro, es muy concreta lo que aprendí y bueno, estoy expandiendo, aprovechando este reto para expandirlo. En realidad yo para el día a día y para el curro uso Blender, con lo que, bueno, ampliando conocimiento. ¿Tú qué te cuentas? ¿Controlas? Houdini, ¿me puedes echar una mano? ¿Estás por curiosidad? ¿Cómo has llegado aquí? Sigo viendo.
Only give us the lowest between these two. We can do maximum. This is another useful one that only takes the highest values. And it'll take me a while to go over all of the different modes. If you have used any sort of compositing software before, or image manipulation software, you'll probably be familiar with all of these.
Vale, el blend lo tengo controlado, que es como el mix color en Blender. Y creo que en Substance Designer se llamaba mix.
Any value that is white will result in the second input. So by doing this, we can shift between these two. So all we're doing is simply...
Vale, uso una rampa como mix. Ah, y está guay porque depende del modo que pongas la rampa, pues puedes enmascarar de una manera o de otra.
It's working on R, G, and B, and that's good, but sometimes we don't want it working on alpha. So I often disable the alpha at the end. That simply avoids...
Es potente, estoy descubriendo que es muy muy potente el Copernicus este. Y está en beta, ¿eh?
Because generally that's not what you want. So keep that in mind. If you have issues with alpha, disable it on your blend nodes. You will see that alpha compositing and swap foreground and background become available for certain operations. Enabling alpha compositing just treats the alpha for each one of the inputs as a constant value of 1, so each layer is considered opaque. Swapping foreground and background just swaps these two inputs. And that's how you use the blend node.
No sé si me gusta que haya el swap ese, porque eso a mí me lía.
Blend node is a very simple node for just blending between various images. So if we were to take
sequence blend, este ya aquí voy perdido.
So we have the butterfly over here. Let's take butterfly 1, we'll make another, and that's going to be butterfly 2,
vale.
and another, that's going to be butterfly 3. If we plug 1 and 2 in, and then use this sequence blend, it just allows us to blend between these two, in the same way that a regular blend node would. So
vale.
node over here.
Está aquí guay, pero solo que es un múltiple mix. Es un multimix, ¿no?
Now, the difference is, the sequence blend allows you to have more than one image, and it'll always normalize the blend value so that no matter how many inputs you have, it'll blend between all of them if you range from 0 to 1. So if I add another butterfly...
Y está normalizado, con lo que tú vas de 0 a 1,
you'll see that this
siempre.
From 0 to 1 actually goes through all 4 of them now.
Muy chulo esto, ¿eh? Este nodo me gusta mucho, en Blender no está y es muy útil y necesario.
If we have 2 inputs, so let's just grab a file and grab one of the butterfly images. So we'll do butterfly 1, duplicate, butterfly 3. Plug both of these into the wipe node and let's see what we have. By default, you can see that it just splits it down the middle like this, and as you...
Vale, este es el wipe. Antes era sequence, esto es wipe.
It will swipe between these.
Un segundo, que me reclaman. Vale, estoy bien.
You can see that the operations...
Está guay el wipe este, ¿eh?
We have other operations as well. For example, we have cross dissolve, and that's just going to blend the one into the other. And then there's also this per pixel flip, where random pixels are flipped to the other.
Oh!
So based on the amount. Now, if we switch this back to wipe, then we can use the shape option as well. And the shape option is going to take a gradient, and that's going to control how to adjust the shape based on the amount. And now you will see that by default, we have a few shape options. We have line, so that just runs in a particular direction, and then based on this amount, it'll blend between them. But we also have things like rectangle, so this will expand outwards. We have circle, same thing. And then 4 corner shrink, where it comes in from 4 different corners. Now, to recreate something like circle, what you would use is a ramp mono. You would set it to concentric, plug it into shape, and you have this, right, where you can expand out from the middle. If you want to hide that line, you can reduce the line width to 0, like that. Now,
Lo de la línea, vale.
Do something like a checkerboard. So I have a checkerboard here. I'm going to do 128 rows and 128 columns.
Esto está chulo. Bueno, así es como hacerlo del pixel, entiendo.
And add this to our ramp. Right, just like that. Now if we plug this in, you'll have a pretty interesting effect where it pixelates from the middle outwards.
Pero solo, sí, sí.
Blends the new one in. So if we take a look at that, just playing it back, it's that sort of effect. So this is just another one of the blend options that we do have available to us, and it allows for some interesting results.
De puta madre, porque de momento lo que hemos visto no me sirve nada para hacer roca.
Next, let's consider some color correction. One of the most useful ones is the brightness node. If we plug this into our source, we can adjust the brightness of the input. Brightness acts as a multiplier, whereas shift acts as an additive value. If we were to switch this to RGB, it now multiplies everything to adjust. So HSV adjust is going to be your sort of go-to color corrector. You can see that we have a U shift. So shifting the U does as you would expect. It adjusts a particular color towards a particular hue. So if we have a constant of, say, blue or something, so let's just make one that is RGB and blue.
Cosa nueva del directo, estoy usando por fin la cámara, se notará el cambio de imagen, igual sería un poquito más oscuro y demás, pero se notará el cambio de imagen porque antes estaba usando el iPhone de cámara y cuando me enviaban un mensaje o algo de repente me quedaba sin vídeo y era una maravilla, la verdad.
And then you plug it in. If you begin shifting it, it'll shift towards other colors. Over here, we also have the saturation scale. Once again, this is a multiplier, much like our brightness node. So we are multiplying our saturation. Alternatively, we have a saturation shift. This is once again additive. So this either adds to the saturation or subtracts from it. The difference being if there are areas that are already low in
Vale, hue saturation value. Este es fácil.
It's going to be just like that. Also subtracting, even up 0, 1.
Constant.
So that's simply what we're doing over here with this HSV adjust, where we say keep luminance on the space alternative. What this does is make a certain area. The brightness is used as a mask for increasing the brightness even further. All this means is that bright areas become even brighter. It's not going to be higher, be what its brightness.
Vale, hasta aquí me parece todo esto fantástico.
Background, that's going to give you a screen operation. So you do have options. So chromatic towards the edges of your image, we enable that.
Oh, qué guapo este, me encanta, tío.
Values. You will see that it doesn't distort the center, and that's because of this ramp, and we'll get to that in a second. But to begin with, the pivot is going to always be at the center. You can, of course, control this and move it over. You'll see that the distortion changes. There is distortion that it causes to the image. You'll see that the edges of...
Ojito con este nodo, ¿eh?
And I'll explain that in a second. Over here, we have some options.
Bueno, yo lo tracearé, no tiene pinta de ser muy difícil, pero está bien este vídeo que te lo cuente así. Lo que pasa es que 5 horas de vídeo, tío.
Ramp mono. This is set up. If you
contáis, hace como un posterizado, ¿no? Vale. Esto lo usarán para hacer el non-physical accurate, para hacer el non-physical render, como se llame.
One thing you will you'll see that strange results. It tends to darken and burn in ways that I don't really like. So what you can do is you can actually separate your values from your colors if you're looking for something like a toon shader. If to mono in this case.
Toon shader, exacto.
So color thing that just like the end. Quantize quite a SOP rather standpoint. To make sure that
standpoint.
See that it would take some explanation node. This one is quite involved, I would say. There's a lot that you can do with it, and so it's going to take some explanation. Firstly, let's use a SOP import. This is generally the best way, because you will see that it requires points. The best way to give it points, the easiest way rather, is to create a SOP import, scatter some points, and then plug it in. So we're going to be taking points from our SOP import into our standpoint. Inside of the SOP import, you can do something that we have those. Let's see. You can just switch between the two and already point. You'll see over here that the clip.
Oh, qué guapo. Esto he visto que hacen locuras con simulaciones para desplazar imágenes y demás. Es una mezcla. Sí, en la página de sidefx lo he estado viendo esta mañana. Lo que no pasa es que no lo entendía bien.
Is your own shape, and the way you would do that, there's plenty of ways, but it allows you to take a shape, so something like a diamond or even a star. Then we can do SDF to mono. That gives us a star that we can then plug in as the stamp 0. If we now look at it, it's now copying stars.
Oh.
On this node, there are some options. For example, we have the scale, so we can scale our stars up or down. Angle, that just rotates our shape. Easier way to see what SOP import and tells it instancing and sprite instancing all at angle and give these some values. So let's do at p scale equals fit01, and then inside of that, we'll do rand at pt num. The range for our p scale can be between 0.2 and 1.
Vale.
Semicolon at the end. And now if we go up a level, we have various.
Wow, y lo hace random el p-scale de...
Randomize CD. You'll see that it doesn't pick up our CD, and that's simply because by default, then.
Vale, esto es lo que me empieza a interesar.
And you can now
y en 3D,
making this for orient.
Claro, los orienta. Al final esto es un render. Es una imagen rasterizada.
Sprites come into the picture. If we do another. And let's just give this some random rotations. If we increase the number of points, so just to 1000, you'll see that we have way more stars over here. Another thing to take note of is that we have this depth sorted over. There are other ways of blending, because as you can see, they overlap. So you can do things like need stamps. Well, it's going to be a diamond, plug that into second input. All we have to do, we just need to give this an attribute for the index. So I at stamp equals 1. Let's see what that gives us. It gives us our diamonds. Let's do circles instead. If we set this to 0, it's going to give us stars. So you can now define which ones get which, and an easy way to do that is just round to integer, rand at pt num.
Vale, otro random.
What we're then going to do is multiply
con un
the
seed
stamps that we have minus 1. So if we have 2 stamps, which we do, then it's going to be 2 minus 1, so it's going to be multiplied by 1. That means we don't need to multiply by to be your RG. Look the same for mono, for these two things, uniform scaling. And then we have something that for the basic also have compound. So compound is going to be more than
el SDF shape este es interesante, ¿eh?
Compound one down to these. So we're subtracting. You can see doing this that your options allows us and the ISO outline. If we remove the shape, we end up with just the outline. So the outline value and the outline width. You can also make it so that it thickens like that, similar to this layout background. So you can even do things with GB and so give out can still of course work with things like the ISO value and get as creative as you want with this. So really useful for USDF from so it's just we'll look at the tile unique IDs. Let's plug that into ID and SDF. Even from some image file node right over here. By default, it brings in this default.pic. It's simply a file we're not really going to look at clone for now.
Solo quedan 4 horas.
A separate Houdini instance where we're feeding information in from that instance. So in this case, we're just looking at file where you get a file from disk. As for border, this is just extends past the given border of the image. What do you want to do with it? Generally, you can leave it at default. If you want the image to repeat its borders, so let's just say that you move this butterfly along to the edge. Do you want it to show on the other side? That's where you would set something like wrap. If you want it to be mirrored across, then you use mirror. If you want it to go by default layers, AOVs from fine, glossy, and depth. So all of those are coming in, and you can easily go through them and see what has been brought in.
Aquí viene la parte de compositing.
AOVs being brought in, you just clear.
Cargo una XR.
One other thing to take note of is that there are some useful
cargo los AOVs.
actually ships with /Houdini grid, and this becomes useful if you want to be texture sampling. So UV before you, that's just save things to disk, just the current frame, fractal noise, and just drag it. It will be written out more than one person like grayscale. So we can say multi-layer.
Pasa que hay cosas que se explican técnicamente, pero tan abstractas que luego encontrarles una utilidad me cuesta a mí mucho.
Kind of confusing if you and adjust from this file to this convolve over here, and you can options around the bottom 3 plus this value on the inside is going to work. So it's this and do so still working with blur right in a different direction -1 -2 and right any different 3x3 isolate how we use and then just set the border to clamp. Now this streak blur doesn't have to just be a particular angle like this. You can define a direction with a UV. So the simplest way would be on white with a noise pad.
Y puedes distorsionar
take this noise and make it a 3D noise
con ruidos y demás, claro.
So that's painted. We can see that it tends to lose some details, but it actually does still maintain edges.
Guajara filter.
Because what it allows is for some really good painterly type effects. Radius is decrease, and none of better result. The radius side.
Está bien para más adelante. Esto tendría que repasarlo para los próximos días. Porque ahí algún día creo que es.
Let's convert that to a mono. So we'll do 2 mono. That's going to be SDF to mono. Plug that in.
Wood, metal, fabric, grunge, scale y graffiti. Para graffiti igual uno de estos funciona.
Increase the scale, can increase our input.
Auto stereo, vale.
Normal. You can now see that it's using that. We can then plug that into the. So if we are light.
Light to normal.
You can now see that it's using the normals to apply a light to clear what's happening from the front. Using which I have normal into normals, and we can actually adjust the lighting of our scene using our normals.
Y puedes hacer relighting aquí.
The best way to use it that I found, if we just delete the C channel, it's then we're going to as this light to our image.
O sea, es una especie de compositor.
Distort that we use put into distort because that is to the direction. Noise. Our noise currently has a center of 0.5, so that means that the values move upwards from 0.5. Set the center to 0, and now you'll have a noise that distorts in both.
Vale.
I did mention this add plenty of so SD slope directions. Then we go into our distort, and if we increase the scale on this, you'll see that it pushes things away from the high areas, almost as if things are falling away from the high areas. That's exactly what that distort is doing. Or you can do the negative.
Me da un puto jari, ¿eh?
As you can see, changing the angle changes the way that it calculates this. And kernel size is just a buff going on, sort of artifacts or anything like that.
A ver, mola muchísimo. O sea, me parece brutal lo potente que es esto. Para estar en beta me parece increíble. Pero claro, tío.
Takes 2 inputs of a
compare
basic edge determinants of the image and compare of each one included in the final result. Really one of Flippy. I do also have 2 render outputs. I have
vale.
And its depth, which you can generate using the additional render vars node. So slap v's from the last render, it'll add n and depth. We can remove the other 2 prim. Now, if we so slap comp block, we can fetch that from our viewport and we can composite it. Now, if we fetch our AOVs from the last render, it'll add n and depth. We can
se trae del último render, o sea, primero renderiza y luego.
And now we can take a look at the other options that we have for edge detection. So if we do on edges, more interesting, we see that it actually you can add like that.
Wow, qué potente es esto, tío.
Is basic, so wet.
Es como un compositor de Blender, sí, pero el compositor de Blender es un chiste al lado de esto.
Settings actually brings it Houdini. If we add AOVs from last render, and then go to things with the reference. If we were to the slap comp options over here, click on slap comp. Now either you can have an external file as your slap comp, or you can choose a cop network, and in this case it takes a cop node. All you have to do is go inside of here, into cop network, choose block end. Now, for a lot of people, they'll get stuck here and it won't work for them. And that's because all of these AOVs that are generated are going to throw errors because they don't actually exist. The thing is, those AOVs only exist in a sort of temporary context. They only exist in our viewport while we're working. The second we render to disk, Houdini actually discards them because it's trying to save on disk space, and so it's not going to save all of those AOVs to our EXR image. That means that when all of these are specified is when you have C, you can...
No, esta es como la parte de compositor.
Import, we'll just use the block, so we won't open it, convert each of these, block. Right, now this can be loaded from disk because and then a comment we just saved to disk. So on our USD renderer, let's go down to the slab comp, add a slab save to create and save our schedule file in the compositing. Almost in material.
Hay que tener en cuenta, hay que tener en cuenta que son 5 horas de vídeo, que para estudiarlo me refiero no memorizarlo, sino comprenderlo, ya solo interiorizarlo, pues es el doble. Entonces aquí hay como 20 o 30 horas de... Vale, esto ya me interesa más.
As for rendering this, if you copy to a rubber toy geometry, this is where you'll use something like a SOP import, and you can use anything you want. So if we do a rubber toy right there, and click from our geometry into the incoming geometry.
Vale, pues entonces no estaba yo muy desencaminado. Lo único que me pasa aquí es que necesito un unwrap porque no tengo UVs. Y si hago el unwrap aquí, ¿no? Y vengo aquí, no, preview, material, shop import, cargo esto. Y visualizo, pues nada, ¿no? Vale, pero porque esto lo tienen en modo, en contexto. Esto no está aquí, sino que ahora mismo lo tiene aquí. Y no puedo pegarlo. Cop network, vale. Preview material, ¿no? Correcto. Y aquí le ha metido un noise, por ejemplo, un fractal noise, me da igual. En el height, con lo que aquí ya estás visualizando esto. Ok, vamos a hacerlo más grande y con una amplitud más pequeñita. Y en realidad no sé si quiero este height o quiero un normal. Creo que es más un normal lo que quiero. No height to normal. Claro, y me dice, hey, warning, amigo. Y yo le digo, no te preocupes, que lo tengo solucionado. Vale. Entonces, si esto lo exagero, aquí ya tenemos algo. Y ahora hago un shop import y le digo, hola, me quiero traer el geotoy. Aquí ya pasan cosas. Aquí ya empiezan a pasar cositas interesantes. Vale, y si este lo borro. Lo que pasa es que hay que ir como con mucho cuidado porque como está esto en beta, a la mínima te hace un... te da una mieja de pechusca y la roscas. Displays, height scale. Esto sí que me gusta, el buscador este que tiene por contexto, que pones 3 letras y ya te... pero en todo Houdini, ¿eh? Vale. Entonces, ¿ahora qué? Fractal noise, no estoy viendo, vale, porque la amplitud es muy pequeña. Ok. Amplitud más grande. Fractal noise. Height to normal, aquí lo tenemos. Previsualizamos. Aquí están pasando cosas, vale. Entonces aquí pasa lo mismo. El normal map scale lo puedo controlar desde aquí, cosa que mola bastante. Y si esto... Edge detect by contour. Edge detect by normal, va. Claro, esto en realidad no puedo visualizar nada porque no existe, porque es temporal, como decía el señor este. Con lo que tendría que ir aquí. Mantra no sería, voy a tirar de karma. Aunque igual. CPU parameter, sí. Igual me peta el directo, ¿eh?
A torus, or a shader ball. However, we can also use our own geometry. This is where you'll use something like a sup import, and you can use anything you want. So if we do a rubber toy right there, and click from our geometry into the incoming geometry for our preview material, we end up with that. So we can preview it on a geometry of our own. As for rendering this, if you copy all of this into a geometry level cop network, so geometry, cop network, paste it inside, then the output actually changes from an image. So if we have this image selected, it actually changes from this, which we've mentioned before is just a grid volume. If your display flag is on the preview material, it actually outputs this, a rubber toy, so actual geometry with a shop material path. However, what you may want to rather do is use nulls, so drop a null and rename it to something like diffuse, roughness, and displacement. And then when creating your actual material at, say, the stage level in a material library or whatever it may be, you can use mtlx image nodes, so these ones over here. And then all you would do is instead of the file name, you would do op and the location to that path. So let's go back up to object level. If we were to press Control-C on our diffuse, back to the stage level, back to our mtlx image, paste it in there. This now gives us access to the diffuse. So then we can do the same for things like roughness. You paste in / roughness and / displacement. And then it's as easy as just using it as an image in this context. So exactly how you would build a usual standard surface. Let's take a look at how we can actually generate different types of height maps and displacements and normal maps, all of those things. Let's go ahead and use a fractal noise. Once again, this is just going to be our go-to. Switch this to a wally cellular, you can actually roughness and / displacement. And then it's as easy as just using it as an image in this context. So exactly how you would build a usual standard surface. Let's take a look at how we can actually generate different types of height maps and displacements and normal maps, all of those things. Let's go ahead and use a fractal noise. Once again, this is just going to be our go-to. Switch this to a wally cellular. We'll increase the element size slightly. And now that we have this would work pretty well as a displacement. But what happens if we want it as a normal map? Well, we can actually do that. We can use the height to normal. Height to normal
keep these settings as default for now. Let's drop down a SOP import. And this is the node that we used in the last video to drive the custom geometry for our If you just started learning Houdini, you're probably learning it wrong. These and get up and running the new cops context. So let's take a look at how we can use this to start generating some textures for our scenes. So Copernicus and cops, they are going to be kind of used interchangeably, so you're going to hear me kind of use them both together. So just know that they will mean the same thing. But I'm in the Solaris context here. You can do this all inside of the geo context if you want, or whatever, wherever you want. But I'm going to be working inside of Solaris because I think that there are some benefits to working inside of Solaris when you're doing this. So let's go ahead and drop down a CopNet. And there are two CopNets that we have available to us. We have Cop Network Old, and that's obviously going to be the old CopNet. The new CopNet is the one that we want, the one that's just plain CopNet. That is going to be the new Copernicus context. So once we have this drop down, we have a few different settings here, and we'll be able to change these at any time, but I want to go over them just real quick. So we have our default resolution here. We have which is going to be, the default resolution will be what size our textures are that we're generating inside there. Our default pixel scale, so this is going to be like a multiplier basically of our resolution. So we'll talk about that here in a moment. We have our default border, so we have some different options here. 16 or down here, little bar. It's drop down that are available inside of the new cops context. We're going to talk about them as we go, but probably the most important one is going to be this preview material. This is going to allow you to, well, preview your materials. So we have a grid that is available to us by default. We can change everything the same except for this divisions. But for now, we're going to change this back, but for now I'm going to set this back to 10, the default, just so I can show.
Investigar cosas que no. Dale, si yo tengo este CopNet, por ejemplo, aquí. Pero claro, está haciendo donde yo no quiero. Dop import, light import. Hey, error con el rubber toy este, tío. Empiezo a entenderlo. Houdini y tal. No veo nada. Pero yo lo que quiero es poder proyectar esto de otra manera, que no. Porque si son procedurales. Ah, coño, que le estoy metiendo. Gente, 2 horitas de directo creo y no hemos sacado mucha cosa en claro, pero está funcionando, no sé ni señalar, la lámpara de lava. Se me hace muy raro, tío, lo del espejo. He podido dedicarle 2 horitas tranquilamente porque hubiese sido imposible esto, hubiese sido completamente imposible entre semana. Que eres seres humanos. Así que, ¿cómo mola? Cómo se rompe los píxeles aquí. No sé por qué pilla eso así. 5 segundos de directo. Espero que haber aclarado algo. Por lo menos yo me lo he... No es complejo. Lo que pasa es que Houdini trabaja de una manera muy indirecta en comparación a Blender. En Blender haces un shader, se lo aplicas directamente al objeto y listo. Y aquí es como que tienes que referenciarlo y demás y... Es mucho más potente, es mucho más polivalente, pero es mucho más complejo de comprender. Pero bueno. Puqueta, tú. Nos vemos mañana para el siguiente. A ver qué toca mañana. Mañana, Mardini. Tengo ganas de hacer un directo de juego, también, de ponerme al Pikmin y no pensar. Mardini 2025. Mardini 2025. Mañana toca madera. Bueno, me preocupa lo justo, porque como no sé hacer piedra, ¿para qué me voy a preocupar en hacer otras historias? En fin, lo dicho, gente, nos vemos mañana. Supongo que por la mañana haré el directo si puedo, y si no, pues no, lo contrario.